Every book, a new way of seeing the world. Welcome to our book club. What if everything you think you know about the Middle East is wrong? Not the oil, not the wars, not the desert. What if the real story of the Middle East is a 5,000-year lesson in how commerce, tolerance, and pragmatism built one of the most successful civilizations on Earth? Today we're covering the Persian Gulf, the 5,000-year history by Alan James Fromherz. He's a history professor at Georgia State University, director of their Middle East Study Center, and he's lived and researched across Oman, Qatar, and the region for years. This book does something radical. It strips away the oil and the conflict and asks, what was the Persian Gulf before all that? The answer will change how you see globalization, trade, and maybe even how you manage teams. 3 big ideas. First, the Persian Gulf was the true center of the world economy for 5,000 years. Second, it ran on a unique brand of commerce-driven tolerance. Third, geography itself made this possible. Let's go. Hashtag idea 1. The world's true center. Here's the most subversive claim in the book. Globalization didn't start with Columbus. Pull the camera back 5,000 years. Most of Europe is still in its infancy. But in the Persian Gulf, a thriving international trade network already connects Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. The Gulf sits at the geographic hypotenuse of Eurasia, the shortest overland route between the Mediterranean and India. It was the original world hub, and it never stopped. Consider Dilmun, roughly modern-day Bahrain. Dilmun had almost no natural resources, but it had perfect geography, right between 2 great civilizations. Mesopotamians brought grain and textiles. Indus Valley traders brought copper, timber, gemstones. They met at Dilmun, exchanged goods at this neutral, safe, freshwater-free port, and went home. Archaeologists found Dilmun seals in Indus Valley ruins. Mesopotamian clay tablets record copper shipments from Dilmun in detail. This was a world system stretching thousands of kilometers, revolving around the Gulf 5,000 years ago. Dilmun's freshwater springs, sweet water bubbling up through salt, made it legendary. Ancient Sumerians called it the fountain of life. Merchants needed it. So did their camels. This wasn't just a port. It was a desert oasis that became a global necessity. Fast forward. The Islamic Empire rises. Baghdad becomes a world city. Its gateway port, Basra, turns into a cultural melting pot where East meets West. Sufi mystics like Hassan of Basra and Rabia al-Adawiyya emerge, teaching inner spirituality that helped Islam transcend regional boundaries. When the Portuguese and British arrived, they immediately fought over Gulf ports like Hormuz and Muscat. In the 15th century, Hormuz was so international that Zheng He's Chinese fleet stopped there. And today, Dubai is just the modern version of Dilmun. Same function, same geography, bigger scale. The point isn't that the West doesn't matter. It's that world history has always had multiple centers. The Persian Gulf was one of the most important, and it still is. That's why oil prices, shipping routes, and geopolitical tremors here ripple across the entire globe. Hashtag idea 2. Tolerance for profit. So the Gulf has been a global trade hub for 5,000 years. People from every faith, every culture, every empire passed through. How did they get along? The answer is brutally practical. They didn't get along because of moral ideals. They got along because tolerance was profitable. Fromherz calls this the rule of commercial oligarchs. Local rulers encouraged trade and used religious tolerance to attract merchants. It wasn't about love. It was about revenue. Here's a scene from the book. The 16th century. Portuguese forces occupy Hormuz. Jesuit missionaries arrive expecting a Catholic stronghold. Instead, they find what one priest called a heathen's paradise. 4 days of rest every week. Christians on Sunday. Jews on Saturday, Muslims on Friday, Hindus on Tuesday. Different faiths lived side by side. They even shared cemeteries. The Jesuits were furious, but the Portuguese officials on the ground didn't care. Here's why. Hormuz produced no food. Everything came by sea. Portuguese income depended on customs duties, not land taxes. If they enforced Catholicism and drove away Muslim, Hindu, and Jewish merchants, they'd destroy their own revenue stream. So the local governor ignored the Inquisition's orders and looked the other way. This pattern repeats across 5,000 years. Merchants had choices. If a port taxed too heavily or ruled too harshly, ships simply sailed to the next one. For a port city, losing merchants meant death. Think of it like extreme market competition. Port cities ruthlessly optimized their business environment to attract customers. And one of the most competitive advantages was cultural tolerance. An earlier example, the 9th century port of Siraf. Its sailors felt as comfortable in Guangzhou as in Basra. One merchant hosted Indian trading partners. Knowing their strict dietary taboos, he prepared separate tables and utensils for every single Indian guest, over 100 people. That detail carries enormous business intelligence. The message: I respect your customs. Your business is welcome here. Now, sometimes this pragmatism went deeper. The Persian poet Sadi Shirazi wrote, "One who has no sympathy for others' pain is not worthy of being called a human being." This wasn't just commercial strategy. It became a humanist ideal that transcended profit. Think about today. Global teams, diverse markets, cross-cultural negotiations. The Gulf model says, stop trying to force uniformity. Find the common interest instead. In a project team, forcing everyone to work the same way creates friction. But if a leader creates an environment where everyone feels respected and points to a shared goal, differences become strengths. Dubai does this at national scale. Zero tariffs, free trade zones, open borders for capital and talent. Same principle, modern execution. The key insight: in complex human systems, the path to cooperation isn't convincing people to agree on values. It's finding a bigger shared interest that makes the disagreement irrelevant. Hashtag idea 3, geography as destiny. We've seen the Gulf as a global hub and a laboratory of commerce-driven tolerance. But here's the deeper question. Why the Gulf specifically? Why did this model survive 5,000 years without being swallowed by empires? The answer is geography. Pure, unforgiving geography. Picture the map. A long, narrow gulf running northwest to southeast. On three sides, extreme terrain. To the west, the Arabian Peninsula and the Rub al-Khali. A desert the size of France with under 51 millimeters of rain per year. Armies don't cross it. To the east, the Zagros Mountains of Persia. Easy to defend, nearly impossible to attack, scarce water. At the southern tip, the estuaries of the Tigris and Euphrates. Vast marshlands with unpredictable waterways that swallowed entire armies. 3 danger zones, forming a natural anti-empire barrier. Alexander's successors, the Persian Empire, Rome, the Ottomans, any of them could control one region. But conquering and holding all 3 simultaneously, with totally different terrains, different local forces, different logistics, nearly impossible. But here's the brilliant part. What kills imperial armies, the marshes, the deserts, the mountains, creates paradise for small, autonomous groups. Hidden waterways, secret bays, desert paths known only to locals. In the gaps between empires, tribes, sheikdoms, and port cities grew like wildflowers. They were flexible, pragmatic, masters of playing great powers against each other. The ultimate example, Great Britain in the 19th century. Britain was the world's strongest naval power. They could have seized the Gulf Coast by force. Instead, they chose a cheaper method, the treaty system, paper fortress. The British Navy signed agreements with Gulf sheiks. Britain acknowledged their authority and promised not to interfere internally. In exchange, sheiks guaranteed safe passage for British ships along the route from Basra to Mumbai. Britain even designed flags, red with white borders, for the signing Arab rulers. Those flags became the prototypes for today's Qatari and Bahraini national flags. Britain did the math. Direct colonial rule was too expensive. Better to make local sheiks into security contractors. The cost was low. The control was real. And Britain's detailed nautical charts stripped away the Arabs' generational navigational advantage. This geography didn't just protect the Gulf. It shaped its political DNA. What the region values: decentralization, autonomy, consultation. Not centralized authority. Not absolute obedience. A Gulf ruler is less like a king and more like the president of a chamber of commerce. Power comes from balancing interests and keeping trade flowing, not from divine right. This matters far beyond the Middle East. Many outcomes in business and life are determined by structural factors you can't change. The question isn't how to fight geography. It's how to use it. Gulf sheiks turned impossible terrain into a survival strategy. They found opportunity inside constraint. That's anti-fragility. Getting stronger under pressure and uncertainty. A principle that applies to startups, careers, and any system operating in chaotic conditions. Hashtag the big takeaway. 3 ideas. 1 framework. The Persian Gulf wasn't the margin of world history. It was a globalization center that persisted for 5,000 years. World history has multiple centers, and understanding that changes how you see everything from trade routes to tech hubs. The region's survival rule, commerce-driven tolerance, is one of the most resilient cooperation models ever invented. Not moral preaching. Shared interest. It works in boardrooms, teams, and negotiations. And the reason it lasted? Geography created structural conditions that made centralized empire nearly impossible, creating space for decentralized, adaptable, commerce-driven communities to thrive for millennia. Together, these three ideas paint a picture of globalization that has nothing to do with Western hegemony. Commerce as engine, pragmatism as culture, geography as foundation. In an era of great power competition and supply chain realignment, this book is a reminder. A world dominated by a single hegemon isn't the only possible future. A multi-center world, more diverse, more decentralized, held together by trade and consultation, has been running successfully for 5,000 years. If you found this valuable, hit subscribe. I cover one book like this every week. Ideas that actually change how you think. See you next time.